Okay, last PowerPoint on the inspector, just in case he comes up as a character question. Okay, so the inspector. Primarily what we want to remember about the inspector is that he is the mouthpiece of Priestley. Whatever he says, that's what Priestley believes. And therefore he is that conscience figure. He's meant to represent the voice of socialism, the voice of Priestley. First time you see him, it's when that doorbell rings and Birling asks for more light. And the stage lighting changes from the pink coziness that we had at the start to something that's brighter and harder. And that mood change is important, because what Gould is going to do is he's going to shine a light. He's going to shine a light on the happenings within the Birling household. He's going to try and illuminate their minds also. He's going to try and bring light, a light of understanding or of recognition into their lives. He succeeds on some levels. He succeeds with Sheila. He succeeds with Eric. But that hope for illumination is not something perhaps that you would say he has achieved with the older Birlings or Gerald. Okay, what's important about the way the inspector speaks is that he uses these short sentences. He has this laconic tone, laconic style of speaking. He gives short answers. He's distinctly unimpressed, and he's certainly not influenced by the Birling family. You know, the nepotism that Mr. Birling tries to use does not do anything to sanction the inspector. He continues on his investigation. He talks about being recently transferred, and, you know, what does that mean? Where's he transferred from? Another town, another planet, another time? That's not important, okay? Who he is not important. What he does is. And that in itself is important, because that's what Priestley's trying to tell you about life. Who you are, you know, who your daddy is and how much money you have, they're not important. But what you do, your actions, how you treat other people, those things are more important. And they're sort of embodied in the idea of the inspector. It doesn't matter who he is, but it does matter what he does. Okay. Now, I talked to you a little bit about that laconic style, those short clipped answers that he has, but also he has this very matter-of-fact tone which he uses, which suggests a level of emotional detachment which you would expect a policeman to have. But also what he does is he uses quite emotive language. You know, he talks about burning her inside out and died in great agony. And so you've got two different things happening at the same time. You've got the emotive quality of what he's saying, and you've got the detachment of his tone. And that is confusing. But perhaps that brings that element of you know, the inspector as an enigma, as a mysterious and confusing character at times. That leads into it. You also have this idea too that Birling is going to try all his usual tactics to get the inspector on side. He tries to ingratiate himself, but the inspector cuts through massively. He has no time. He has no time for these social graces or these airs that Birling adopts. What he has to do is do his investigation the way that he will normally do it. When the inspector speaks to Birling, he does it in a particular way. What he wants to do is show the photograph to each person individually, and he explains why he does that, because he said one person and one line of inquiry at a time, which helps move the drama on, creates the drama, because of course each person sees a photograph, and as Croft says at the end, how do we know it was the same girl? But most importantly, that line is important because it's a metaphor for how we need to appreciate each other as individuals and not merely representatives. So, for example, when Mrs. Birling talks about Eva, she talks about girls of that class or girls of that sort. She doesn't see Eva as an individual. She just sees her part of a homogenized group, a group of people who are all the same. But what you have with the inspector is he's saying, no, you look at one person, you look at the individual, because if you see people as individuals, then it's harder to ignore the situation that they're in. Also too, the inspector speaks, as I said before, with these clipped answers. He's quite enigmatic, i.e. sometimes it's hard to work out where he is and what he's doing, and that's part of his mystery. That's what Priestley wants to create with him. Okay, so I've talked before with the Gerald and Birling one about that moment of dark comedy there. But what I think is important here is the philosophy of the inspector, because he says what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, and what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide, a chain of events. And really, for the characters that progress in the play, they're the characters who understand that chain. For the characters who just see the past, present and future as three distinct states, that there is no hope for progress, that they are not those characters who are imbued with any sort of moral progression. But the idea of a chain of events, that is what the inspector is trying to bring. That's the sort of illumination that he's trying to bring into the Birling household, that there's a circularity about things, and again that represents Priestley's own ideas. Okay, as again the idea of the name Ghoul. Now Ghoul could be like a ghoul, like a ghost, perhaps suggesting that he's something that's supernatural, but really that is not important. As I said before, who he is doesn't matter, what he is does, and that's Priestley's central message. Talked a little bit before about the nepotism, using that to try and threaten the inspector. It doesn't work. The inspector disempowers Birling by pretending not to understand his humour. He really is always, once the inspector comes into that room, the inspector owns the room. The inspector is in charge. And even when Mrs. Birling tries to challenge him, she doesn't do that successfully. The only time that anyone has an opportunity to command in that room once the inspector is there is in Act 3, when Mr. Birling commands that Mrs. Birling leaves the room, and the inspector agrees because he understands that Mrs. Birling or Mr. Birling is trying to take responsibility. Okay, when Sheila's speaking to the inspector, what you have is this idea again of the emotive language he uses: lonely, half-starved, desperate, and this horrifies Sheila. And the inspector says there are lots of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in the country, Mrs. Birling. If they weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. You know, the political message of the inspector is there for everyone to see. It's not hidden. It's not a hidden agenda that he has. It's very clearly a political message. And it works because it changes the way Sheila thinks about things. When she is confronted with her actions in relation to the exploitation of others, she changes it, you know. And the inspector says, it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these women, and that's what he's there to do. He's there to help her walk in the shoes of another person. You know, he's there to allow her to experience for a second what things might have been like for Eva, because he knows that the young ones can be receptive to that. But he's not there. He's not there to give Sheila a comfortable ride. He's not there to pander to her the way that everybody has pandered to her all her life. And so when she gets upset thinking that she wishes she could change things, he says, yes, but you can't. It's too late. She's dead. And again, that laconic style of speaking that he uses, Sheila has to learn that lesson. And it's the inspector's job to make her learn that lesson. And therefore, he's not going to dress this up in a way that makes it more palatable for her. What he wants to do is for her to learn that lesson, and if she has to learn it through harsh language, well, she'll learn it through harsh language. Okay, one of the things about the inspector and his mysterious side is this idea that he has preternatural powers, beyond natural powers to understand things. And again, then people go looking for the idea that he's supernatural, and that's not an avenue you want to go down, because yes, he does have these abilities to understand, but why he has them isn't important. What he does with them is. Again, he uses language that seems to be very emotive in relation to Eva. Like everybody who speaks about Eva, he speaks of Eva in a way where she seems flawless. You have that idea of her as the epitome of the dignified working class girl, dignified working class woman. As I said before, the inspector creates drama. He's not trying to spare Sheila from the pain of responsibility. Responsibility is not an easy thing. To accept responsibility isn't easy. The inspector knows that, and he wants Sheila to realise that it's not easy, but it still has to be done. Okay, he ignores Sheila's stage direction to ask him to stop, whenever he's explaining to Gerald why Sheila wants to stay. But he understands the conscience, the burden on her conscience, because he says that Sheila will be alone with the responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow, and the next. So what he does is he understands her, and also he says he doesn't separate himself. He says that that idea that we all need to work on this together, this accepting of responsibility. He places himself alongside the lovers, making it easy for them to accept what he's saying, the veracity of what he's saying, the truth of what he's saying. Whenever Sheila is aware of the inspector's power, she moves closer to him, and again that's important because it's symbolic of how she's moving closer to his moralistic point of view, and that makes her seem like a better character in our minds, that we have hope for her, that she can change. And the inspector's response to Mrs. Birling, when Mrs. Birling says, "Oh, you've made quite an impression on the child," is that he says, "We often do," which suggests that perhaps he's part of a team. That idea that whatever purpose he serves, he's not the lone person who thinks like that. And of course that concurs with what we know, because he is the voice piece of the socialist left, men like J.B. Priestley, like George Bernard Shaw, that's alluded to in the play, and H.G. Wells, left-wing thinkers who do have influence on the young, who had influence on the youth in 1912 and in 1946. Okay, the message of the inspector, it's Priestley's socialist message, as I said that before. It's about this idea that we have responsibilities as well as privileges. And again, that idea that he's there to illuminate, he's there to make that light of understanding something that is apparent within the Birling household. It's the two elder Birlings who unfortunately are not able to understand that. The younger Birlings are. Okay, now you've got a real battle between the inspector and Mrs. Birling, because Mrs. Birling represents that wall. Do you remember Sheila says that, "Oh, you mustn't build up a wall"? Mrs. Birling is that wall, and it's the inspector's job to try and breach it, to try and get her to feel, to understand, to accept responsibility. And it's a very hard thing for the inspector to do. You have this idea too, that for Mrs. Birling, she is at war with the inspector. He represents everything that she stands opposed to, and there's a real dueling match between them. When the inspector continues to investigate Mrs. Birling, he speaks to her severely and sharply. If you look at those adverbs, he's not pulling any punches here. He really needs to sort of chip away at her exterior, the arrogance of her sort of imperious attitude. So just as he didn't want to save Sheila from the pain of responsibility here, he's not trying to save Mrs. Birling from anything. He's trying to goad her into action, trying to get her to listen to him, which of course she doesn't do. So because she doesn't do that, what he does is he tricks her. He uses her arrogance against her. So the inspector changes tactics when he feels that Mrs. Birling's haughtiness remains. Like he did with Sheila, he attempts to use graphic details, to chip away at this exterior of Mrs. Birling. It doesn't work. The only way to get her is to trick her by using her arrogance against her. Okay, I think his attack on Mrs. Birling is more personal than it is on anybody else because of her defensiveness. And what you have here is he uses the highly emotive language, and he uses that more than he does with any other character. He tries to draw a parallel between the two women. He says, you have children, you must have known how she was feeling. But of course, that's a nice little bit of irony. It's ironic because, of course, we're aware of Mrs. Birling as a very cold mother. Very, she lacks any sort of demonstrative connection with her children. So just because she is a mother doesn't actually suggest that she knows how Eva was feeling, because Mrs. Birling seems emotionally detached. Okay, so the trap is the only way to get her, and it shows the cleverness of the inspector to do that. He speaks very sternly to her, and he allows her to vent her frustration. So he sees that her view is intractable, it's not going to change, and she focuses on that young idler who needs to be made an example of, and so he's trapping her. His language helps her sort of vent her anger, vent her frustration, and allows her to fall into the trap that he's made for her. There's this wonderful moment where the inspector has this silent gesture of control, where he holds up a hand just at the point where we've all sort of been aware that it's Eric who is the young idler, that Eric is that pitiful figure, and that silent holding up the hand just shows a level of control. It's his way of perhaps accepting that she's fallen into his trap and he's now gained the upper hand. With the inspector, Eric is very honest, damningly honest, and there is an understanding too that the inspector has a level of understanding in relation to Eric that his dad doesn't have. He also knows that what will happen now will cause a need for family readjustment, and of course we see how deeply that family readjustment is needed at the end of Act 3, but there doesn't seem to be much chance that'll happen. And when the inspector agrees that Eric can have a drink, it's more important than just understanding Eric. What he's doing is he's showing that as a father, Birling is inept. He doesn't understand what his son needs, whereas even this stranger who's just walked into Eric's life seems to understand him better. Okay, you have this idea too that during the confrontation with Eric, during the confession with Eric, the inspector doesn't need to ask anything. Eric just tells everything, he blurts it all out, and then the tension begins between Eric, his mum and his dad, and it's up to the inspector then to reclaim a position of power and authority without use of the word stop. And just as he said in Act 1, one person, one line of investigation, one person at a time, what he does is then he looks at each member of the family. He addresses each one of them in relation to Eva Smith's death. And he makes clear that that chain of events is apparent. The chain of personal and social events is not simply a metaphor for the way the class system holds people like Eva Smith and John Smith in their subservient position, but it's a neat way for the inspector to kind of sort of sum up his moral code. That we have to think of ourselves as individuals, that we're all social beings, that individual deeds linked together can have huge, huge repercussions. And we have to see the world in terms of our place within it, our place within that chain of personal responsibility. The inspector's monologue, his final monologue, is important because what he does is he broadens his argument and he brings in a level of passion, a level of rhetorical richness that he's never had before. The kind of laconic style that he's had goes, and instead what he does is he brings in metaphor. He talks about, if we won't learn that lesson, we'll learn it in fire and blood and anguish. Itself a metaphor for World War I and World War II. And it's as if all of the passion that he's had to keep, hidden, comes out in that monologue. His last blast, his last attempt to make them think and feel in the way that he wants them to think and feel. And he says too about this idea that one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. And just the millions and millions and millions, repetition of millions and the conjunction there, hammer homes the message that, that we are members of one body, that we do not live alone, that as individuals we have to be responsible for the fact that we're part of this social chain of being. And that's the inspector's message. So finally, that idea of who the inspector is, it's open to interpretation, and there are a myriad of different ways and means that you can try and think of the inspector. But the one thing for you to remember is that the inspector is the mouthpiece of Priestley. He's everything that Priestley wants him to be. He is this conscience figure who's meant to represent the conscience of the audience. He is meant to be this embodiment of what sort of socialistic ideas. And most importantly, what he does is he represents the idea that who you are doesn't matter, but what you do does.